Right now, if you picture armor, you're probably imagining something specific: gleaming plate metal, a knight on horseback, maybe chainmail glinting in the sun. But that image represents a comparatively late, highly refined stage of a technology that actually stretches back considerably further into human history than most people assume. So, when did humans actually first start protecting their bodies with dedicated armor, and what did the very earliest versions of this technology actually look like before metal was ever involved at all? Let's dig into this properly, because the answer connects directly to broader questions about early human conflict, hunting, and material technology, and it reveals a much longer, more gradual story than the popular image of shining medieval plate armor might initially suggest. Let's start with the most basic underlying logic worth establishing first, because it explains why armor likely developed as early as it did. Once early humans began using projectile weapons and edged tools capable of causing serious injury, whether for hunting large, dangerous animals or during conflict with other human groups, there would have been an immediate, obvious practical incentive to develop some kind of protective countermeasure. This basic offense-defense dynamic, where the development of an effective weapon creates direct pressure toward developing a corresponding protective technology, represents one of the most consistent, recurring patterns throughout the entire history of human technological development. And it's reasonable to assume this same basic dynamic was already at work extremely early in human history, likely not long after early humans first developed reasonably effective weapons capable of causing serious injury in the first place. Let's talk about the earliest plausible forms of protective technology, because the very first armor almost certainly didn't look anything like later, more sophisticated versions. The earliest protective coverings were likely extremely simple, probably consisting of thick animal hide, worn either as a direct extension of ordinary protective clothing already being developed and used for warmth and environmental protection, or as a more specifically reinforced covering intentionally selected and prepared for its particular resistance to cuts and punctures. This connects directly to broader questions already explored regarding when and how early humans first developed clothing more generally, since basic protective armor likely emerged as a natural, gradual extension of that same underlying hide-working technology and expertise, rather than representing some kind of entirely separate, independently invented technology developed completely from scratch. Let's talk about the archaeological challenge involved in actually confirming this early timeline, because this represents a familiar methodological issue that comes up constantly throughout the study of early human material culture and technology more broadly. Just like early clothing and early footwear already explored in other exploration of ancient technology, the earliest protective coverings were almost certainly made from organic materials, hide, wood, and various plant fibers that simply don't survive intact across tens of thousands of years the way stone tools or bone fragments typically do. This means direct, physical archaeological evidence for the very earliest armor is extremely limited, forcing researchers to rely heavily on indirect evidence and reasonable inference. Drawing on later, better preserved examples, comparative research on tool and weapon technology, and careful examination of ancient skeletal remains for injury patterns that might indicate the presence or absence of protective covering during specific documented conflicts or hunting incidents. Let's talk about skeletal evidence specifically, because this represents one of the more interesting indirect methods researchers have used to draw conclusions about early protective technology. Researchers examining ancient skeletal remains showing evidence of violent injury sometimes look closely at the specific location, pattern, and severity of wounds to infer whether the injured individual might have been wearing some form of protective covering at the time of injury. Wounds that appear deflected, redirected, or otherwise inconsistent with a direct, unimpeded strike can sometimes suggest the presence of an intervening protective layer, even when no direct physical evidence of that protective material itself has survived. This kind of forensic-style analysis provides valuable, though admittedly indirect and sometimes ambiguous, supporting evidence for early protective technology use, extending our understanding of this topic considerably further back than what direct physical armor remains alone could ever confirm on their own. Let's talk about specific, well-documented early materials and designs now, because once you move into periods with better preserved archaeological evidence, the picture becomes considerably clearer and more detailed. Hardened leather, treated and prepared through various tanning and hardening processes to increase its resistance to cuts and punctures, represents one of the most widespread and long-lasting early armor materials used across an enormous range of different ancient cultures and regions. This kind of hardened leather armor offered meaningful protective value while remaining considerably lighter and more affordable to produce compared to later metal alternatives, making it a practical, accessible choice for a very wide range of early societies, regardless of whether that particular society had access to metalworking technology at all. Let's talk about wood and wicker-based armor too, because this represents another significant early material category worth exploring specifically. Various ancient cultures developed armor incorporating wooden slats, wicker frameworks, or similar rigid plant-based materials, sometimes combined with hide or fabric backing, offering a different balance of protection, weight, and material availability compared to pure hide-based designs. This kind of construction shows up independently across a wide range of different ancient cultures and regions, from various parts of Asia to indigenous cultures in different parts of the world, representing yet another example of the broader pattern already discussed extensively throughout other topics regarding independent technological convergence. Different populations facing the same basic underlying challenge, protecting the body against edged or blunt weapons, arriving at broadly similar practical solutions using whatever locally available materials happen to be most practical and effective within their own specific environment and technological capability. Let's talk about bone and shell-based armor too, because certain cultures developed remarkably distinctive protective designs using these particular materials, worth exploring as a specific example of localized material innovation. Some indigenous cultures, particularly certain Arctic and Pacific coastal populations, developed sophisticated armor incorporating small, overlapping plates made from bone, ivory, or hardened shell, carefully connected together using cordage into a flexible yet protective covering, conceptually similar in basic design logic to later metal scale or lamellar armor, but constructed entirely from locally available organic materials rather than metal. This represents a particularly striking example of convergent design thinking, arriving independently at a broadly similar structural solution, small, overlapping protective plates connected into a flexible covering, using completely different, locally available raw materials compared to cultures that happened to have earlier access to metalworking technology specifically. Let's talk about shields specifically too, because they represent a closely related but importantly distinct category of protective technology worth examining separately from body armor itself. Unlike armor, which is worn directly on the body, shields function as a separate, actively wielded protective tool, offering the wearer active, deliberate control over exactly where and how protection gets deployed during a specific encounter, rather than providing the more passive, constant coverage body armor typically offers. Shield technology likely developed roughly alongside early body armor, driven by the exact same basic offense-defense logic already discussed, and early shields were almost certainly constructed from similarly accessible organic materials, wood, hide, and woven plant fiber, before later incorporating metal reinforcement and, eventually in some specific military traditions, full metal construction. Archaeological and artistic evidence, including depictions found in ancient artwork predating well-preserved physical shield, remains themselves suggests shields were already a well-established, widely used technology very early in recorded human history, reinforcing the broader picture already established regarding just how early this entire category of protective technology likely emerged. Let's talk about layered and composite armor construction too, because this represents an important technical detail worth exploring in more depth, given how much it reveals about the actual sophistication of early armor design well before advanced metalworking became available. Rather than relying on a single material alone, many effective early armor designs incorporated multiple layers or combined different materials specifically to balance competing protective and practical needs more effectively than any single material could achieve on its own. Quilted or layered fabric armor, for instance, developed independently across numerous different ancient cultures using multiple layers of tightly packed fabric, sometimes combined with other reinforcing materials, to create a surprisingly effective protective barrier against certain types of weapons, particularly slashing attacks, while remaining considerably lighter and more affordable to produce compared to metal or hardened leather alternatives. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. This kind of layered, composite construction approach demonstrates a fairly sophisticated understanding of practical material science developed entirely through generations of accumulated trial and error, long before anyone had any formal theoretical understanding of the specific physical principles explaining exactly why layering or combining certain materials in particular ways actually improved overall protective performance. Let's talk about textile-based armor traditions specifically too, because certain cultures developed remarkably effective fabric-based protective technology worth highlighting as its own distinct category. Various cultures across different regions and time periods developed sophisticated quilted or layered textile armor, sometimes reinforced with additional materials like paper, in the case of certain historical East Asian traditions, or dense cotton padding, in the case of various traditions found in Mesoamerica prior to European contact. These textile-based approaches offered a meaningfully different set of practical trade-offs compared to metal or hardened hide alternatives, typically lighter, more breathable in hot climates, and less expensive to produce, while still offering meaningful protective value against many common weapon types of their specific historical period, particularly slashing and certain projectile weapons, even though they generally offered somewhat reduced protection against the most powerful piercing weapons compared to metal alternatives specifically. This detail reinforces an important theme worth carrying through the rest of this discussion. There was never one single, universally superior armor material or design throughout human history. Different materials and construction approaches offered different specific trade-offs, and different cultures made different reasonable choices based on their own particular climate, available resources, typical combat conditions, and the specific types of weapons and threats their armor most commonly needed to defend against, rather than everyone simply converging on one single, objectively best solution regardless of local circumstances. Let's talk about horse armor and equipment protection too, because as cavalry warfare developed across various ancient and historical cultures, the practical need to protect a rider's horse alongside the rider themselves became an increasingly significant additional consideration within this broader technological story. Various cultures developed specialized armor specifically designed for horses, ranging from simple padded coverings to increasingly elaborate metal barding in certain later historical periods, representing yet another specialized branch of this same broader protective technology story, driven by the same basic underlying logic already discussed but adapted specifically to the practical requirements and constraints of protecting a much larger animal actively engaged in combat alongside its rider. Let's talk about how researchers actually date and confirm specific early armor technology across these various different traditions too, because this connects back to the broader methodological point already raised regarding the inherent challenge of studying organic, perishable materials specifically. Beyond skeletal injury analysis already discussed, researchers also rely heavily on artistic depictions, carved reliefs, painted pottery, and other visual artwork that happened to depict armor being actively worn or used, which can sometimes push back the confirmed timeline for a specific armor style considerably further than surviving physical examples alone could ever support, since a detailed artistic depiction can preserve accurate information about a specific technology's appearance and use even when the actual physical materials involved have long since completely decomposed and disappeared from the archaeological record entirely. Now let's talk about the transition toward metal armor, because this represents a major, well-documented turning point in the overall history of this technology. Once human societies developed reliable metalworking capability, first with copper and bronze, and later with iron and eventually steel. Armor design gradually began incorporating metal components, initially often combined with earlier organic materials rather than replacing them outright, before eventually evolving into the more familiar fully metal designs most people immediately associate with the word armor today. Early metal armor often took the form of small metal plates or scales attached to a flexible fabric or leather backing, offering considerably enhanced protection against edged weapons specifically compared to purely organic armor materials, while still retaining some of the flexibility and lighter weight of the earlier hide and fabric-based designs that metal components were initially layered onto rather than immediately, completely replacing. Let's talk about Bronze Age armor specifically too, because certain surviving examples from this period offer particularly striking, well-preserved evidence of just how sophisticated early metal armor technology had already become. Several remarkably well-preserved full bronze body armor sets have been discovered at various European archaeological sites, dated to roughly 3,000 years ago, showing sophisticated shaping and construction techniques specifically designed to fit closely to the wearer's torso, while still allowing reasonable freedom of movement, representing a considerable technological achievement for the specific metalworking capability available during that particular historical period. This detail is worth appreciating because it demonstrates that fully developed metal body armor isn't purely a much later medieval innovation, as popular imagination centered around knights in shining plate armor might otherwise suggest. Sophisticated metal armor technology, while certainly continuing to develop and improve considerably over subsequent centuries and millennia, actually has considerably deeper roots stretching back into the Bronze Age specifically, several thousand years before anything resembling medieval European plate armor eventually developed. Let's talk about helmet development specifically too, because head protection represents an important, frequently separately studied category worth exploring on its own. Given how vulnerable and critical the head specifically is during any kind of physical conflict, helmet-style head protection appears to have developed quite early alongside broader body armor technology, with various early designs incorporating hardened leather, wood, or, once available, metal components specifically shaped to protect the skull while still allowing adequate visibility and hearing for the wearer to remain effective during active combat. Helmet design in particular shows remarkable diversity and independent innovation across different ancient cultures and regions, each developing specific solutions shaped by their own available materials, typical combat style, and specific tactical considerations relevant to their own particular military and hunting practices. Let's talk about armor and social status too, because this connects to a broader theme already explored extensively regarding how practical technologies frequently pick up additional layers of social and cultural significance well beyond their original, purely functional purpose. In a huge number of ancient and historical societies, high-quality armor represented a significant, considerable material investment, requiring skilled craftsmanship and often expensive or difficult to obtain materials, particularly once metal components became involved. This meant access to the highest quality, most protective armor frequently correlated closely with wealth and social status, with elite warriors and leaders typically possessing considerably more sophisticated, protective, and often decoratively elaborate armor compared to ordinary soldiers or fighters within the same broader society or military force. This pattern echoes similar dynamics already discussed regarding clothing and status more generally, reinforcing a consistent theme running throughout the study of early human material culture. Practical protective technology, once developed, almost immediately began serving a dual function, offering genuine physical protection while simultaneously functioning as a visible marker of wealth, status, and social position within a given society, two purposes that developed together and reinforced each other, rather than representing separate, sequential phases of the technology's overall development. Let's talk about the specific tactical and practical trade-offs involved in armor design too, because this represents an important, often underappreciated dimension of the whole topic. Effective armor design has always required carefully balancing competing practical considerations: protection level, weight, mobility, cost, and manufacturing complexity, rather than simply maximizing protection without any consideration for these other important practical factors. Heavier, more protective armor designs generally sacrifice mobility and endurance, while lighter designs offered better mobility and reduced fatigue at the direct cost of somewhat reduced overall protection. Different military cultures and combat styles throughout history made different specific trade-offs along the same basic spectrum, shaped by their own particular tactical approach, typical combat conditions, and the specific types of weapons and threats their armor primarily needed to defend against. Let's talk about the psychological dimension of armor too, because this represents an interesting, often underappreciated aspect of the whole topic worth including before wrapping up. Beyond its purely physical protective function, armor likely served an important psychological role for both the wearer and their opponents, potentially boosting a wearer's confidence and willingness to engage in combat, while simultaneously projecting visible strength, wealth, or intimidation toward opponents and observers alike. This psychological dimension connects directly back to the earlier discussion of armor and social status, since particularly elaborate or visually striking armor could serve as a form of psychological warfare in its own right, independent of its actual, measurable physical protective properties. A dynamic that plausibly shaped armor design and decoration choices across many different ancient and historical cultures, well beyond purely practical protective considerations alone. It's worth acknowledging honestly, before wrapping up, that significant uncertainty remains regarding the very earliest stages of this technology's development, given how thoroughly organic materials fail to survive across such an enormous span of prehistoric time. Researchers continue to rely on a careful, necessarily incomplete combination of skeletal analysis, comparative anthropological research, and reasonable inference drawn from later, better documented periods, meaning the precise timeline for humanity's very first armor remains, and will likely always remain, somewhat less firmly established compared to many other, better preserved categories of ancient material culture and technology. Let's zoom out and pull all of these different threads together, because the full story of when and how humans first invented armor turns out to be considerably longer, more gradual, and more materially diverse than the popular image of medieval metal plate armor alone could ever fully capture. Armor likely emerged remarkably early in human history, as a natural, logical response to the development of increasingly effective weapons and tools capable of causing serious injury, initially taking the form of simple, hardened hide or other organic protective coverings that have left frustratingly little direct physical evidence for modern researchers to examine. Over an enormous span of subsequent history, armor technology continued developing independently across a huge range of different cultures and regions, incorporating wood, bone, shell, and eventually metal. Each specific culture arriving at its own particular practical solutions shaped by locally available materials and specific tactical needs, eventually culminating in the sophisticated metal armor traditions, Bronze Age, and later that represent the more familiar, more thoroughly documented later chapters of this extraordinarily long overall technological story. So the next time you picture a suit of gleaming medieval armor, it's worth remembering that you're looking at merely one particularly well-documented relatively late chapter within an enormously longer overall story of human protective technology, one that likely stretches back tens of thousands of years earlier to the very first early human who realized that a properly prepared piece of thick animal hide, worn at exactly the right moment, could mean the difference between a survivable injury and a fatal one, which leaves an interesting thought worth sitting with. If something is visually associated with a single, specific historical period as armor, actually has roots extending this much further back into deep prehistory, built from simple organic materials that left almost no direct physical trace behind, what other technologies you associate primarily with one particular, well-documented historical era might actually have a much longer, much more gradual, and much less visible prehistoric backstory quietly hiding behind their more familiar, better documented later form?